In this video, we're going to set up a Windows system for developing Cordova apps. I like to start with getting my build environment sorted. I use Git for source control and Visual Studio Code to edit the code files. Let's start by installing Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code works on Windows, Linux, Mac OS. It's a great way to get used to a single coding environment that you can use over all those platforms. It has some pretty cool features like integrated terminal code completion. You can see it's downloading now, and we can install it when the download's finished by clicking on our downloaded file. Here we go. Pretty typical Windows installer. We'll go through a handful of options and then start Visual Studio Code. Like a lot of these products, this one is an Electron app, which means that it's actually running in a web browser, but without all the web browser controls. We'll create a desktop icon so we can find it easily. We'll create some actions so that we can open from the Windows Explorer and install. There's thousands of different add-ons available for Visual Studio Code, so you'll be able to use it for more than just Cordova application development. The plan with this video is that you'll be able to follow along, so you'll just have to be patient as we do everything in real time and wait for all these dialogues to go across. There we go. We won't launch Visual Studio Code now, we'll finish that install. So the next tool that I always have on a system for code source control is Git. So it's the Git-SCM site is where you go to install Git. It also installs a command line. So you see we can download for Windows. The download should start automatically. It should pick that we're on a 64-bit system. You'll see that that started down the bottom left. I just mentioned that one of the tools that's installed with this is Git Bash, which is a Linux style command line. So if you're used to working in a Unix type system, so that's Linux, Mac OS, you'll be familiar with the commands in that Git Bash environment. One of the nice things about Visual Studio Code is that it lets you run a terminal alongside your code editing, and when we run Visual Studio Code after installing Git and Git Bash, I'll set Visual Studio Code up to use Git Bash as the default terminal. Obviously you can still use PowerShell or the Windows command line, but in later videos we're also going to be showing building a iOS app using Cordova, so it's quite handy to be familiar with the standard Linux, Unix commands. Going through the final stages, we can click on the Git installer. Nothing that we especially want to do in these settings. We won't use Vim as the default editor. Vim's a bit of a hard editor to use, and given we've just installed Visual Studio Code, we can use that as Git's default editor. This means that if we have to type in any commit messages or anything from Git, it'll go into Visual Studio Code and make it a nice experience. We'll allow Git from the command line and also third-party software. This means that we can use Git from Git Bash or the Windows command prompt or Windows PowerShell. OpenSSL is our library of choice, and we'll leave the checkout Windows style, Unix style line endings as the default. Again, defaults through here. And another dialog to go through. So in this stage we're just setting up Visual Studio Code and Git so that we've got the basic setup for a good development environment on our Windows machine. We won't actually be using Git during this series of videos, but we will use the Git Bash command line, which comes in this package. Here we go. No need to view the release notes at this point. What we will do though is we will launch Visual Studio Code and we will set up Git Bash as our default command line. The way that you get to a lot of the commands in Visual Studio Code is through Control-Shift-P. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show the terminal, and by default the new terminal comes up in PowerShell, and we're going to change that to Git Bash. So Shift Control P, and we can set up our shell. So go default shell. So it says terminal, select default shell, and we can pick Git Bash. Once that's done, I'm going to close and reopen Visual Studio Code. You'll see when the terminal comes up that it's a slightly different look, much more similar to, well, it is a Unix style command line, Bash. So now that we've got our editor and our source code control system set up, it's time to install Cordova. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head straight to the Cordova website and follow their setup guide. So it's cordova.apache.org, and they have a getting started guide with a section on installing Cordova. So Cordova command line runs on Node.js and is available on NPM. Right, we need to install Node.js. NPM is a tool that is part of Node.js. So there's no need to separately install NPM, but we will update it. So we'll pick the long-term support release for Node. It's going to download an installer, and we will use that to install Node. So if you haven't heard of Node before, it's basically JavaScript on the server. So instead of JavaScript only running in a web browser, you can run it locally on your machine and do all sorts of JavaScript, lots of file manipulation and things like that, and that's what Cordova does. There's also a library of plugins for Node that provide a whole lot of additional functionality. So you'll see that when we install Node, when we update NPM, and we install Cordova, it'll go off to the web and fetch all the components we need. Anyone's getting into a lot of JavaScript development these days, Node is used a lot, and npm, the package system, is used extensively when using Node or when building projects to be run on traditional websites. Or in this case, building projects to be run on a mobile device with Cordova. So once the Node install finishes, we're going to jump into VS Code, into our command line, and we can type node version, like that. Let's try npm version. We might just try that again. There we go. So we just needed to restart Visual Studio Code. npm-v tells us the version of npm we're running. I believe Node does the same thing. So the long-term support branch on that website was version 12. So to install a package, it's npm install. In this case, we're going to use npm to install npm, which is how you update a npm package. And the -g means global. So it installs it for all users. Installs it for all projects on the system. So you can have different Node modules installed for different development projects. It's running off now onto the internet to bring down the new version of npm. If there is a new version, this is just good housekeeping when you install Node to update npm. While that's running, we'll just jump back to the Cordova website. If we follow the instructions here, it says that to install Cordova, we're doing npm install -g Cordova. It's the same command we used to update npm. So when we go back to Visual Studio Code, we'll be able to run that. We'll also be able to just run our npm version command again to make sure, we've got 6.14.7 and we were 6.14.6, so it wasn't a big upgrade. Let's install Cordova, npm install -g Cordova. Doesn't matter where you put the -g, you can put it before or after the package name. npm will check its repositories, see if there is a package called Cordova, and install it. Again, the -g object means we're installing it globally. As you see, there's a few deprecated messages there. That means that the person who published these Node modules or npm packages has said that they're no longer maintaining them. So we're being warned that that's a risk. We're relying on the Cordova project to manage all this for us. If there was any risk, they would move Cordova to use different packages. It's one of the things with modern JavaScript development is that everything is built with quite a few npm packages. When we get into doing Cordova builds later on, you'll see that all the Cordova plugins are also npm packages. So it's a really important infrastructure to understand when you get into building Cordova apps. Alright, so we now have Cordova version 9.0.0 installed, and we can access that on the command line by typing Cordova. So I'm going to allow Cordova So that was just getting the Cordova version command, so 9.0.0, confirming what npm had told us. So that is Cordova installed. But let's just check back at our document. We've done everything we need to do to install Cordova. What I'm going to do is follow this up with another video on setting up the build environment for Android, and then we'll go through and create a project and run it either on an Android device or in the Android simulator. Bye for now.